we often struggle with deep resistance to our own true self, often because we think that we're confused, that we don't know what it is. And again, James Martin, in his book, Becoming Who You Are, says this. So how do you determine if something is an essential part of your true self or simply an unfreedom that needs to be challenged? Good question. Basically, one has to ask, is this part of myself keeping me from being more loving and generous? Is this keeping me from being closer to God and other people? If the answer is yes, perhaps it may be time to consider how you could move away from whatever prevents you from being more loving and more generous. And so, as we are examining making these structural changes in our life, perhaps it's letting go of something. Perhaps it's embracing something. I want to ask you a question. These are important questions. These are guiding questions. These are the kind of questions that allow us to dive deep into who you are. So what I want you to do is this. If you have a pen and paper handy, write these two questions and answer them. The unfortunate truth about the situation is, therefore, the right action to take is. Breathing in, The unfortunate truth about the situation is, with all my denial, with all my avoidance, with all the things that are going on, what is the truth about the situation? Maybe it's inconvenient to face it, but perhaps it's time to do just that. And therefore, what is the right action to be taken? I asked these questions last week in Sunday service, and people began to talk about these things. There were financial issues, there were health issues, there were things that people had put on the back burner that are now facing. This is now time to do this. It's about listening to that still small voice within us and allowing that to guide us. Henri Nouwen says this: every time you listen with great attentiveness to that voice that calls you the beloved, you will discover within yourself a desire to hear that voice longer and more deeply. It's like discovering a well in the desert. And so part of our practice is cultivating quiet time so we can listen to that voice that calls us the beloved. And maybe you hear that voice when you're sitting in your garden. And maybe you hear that voice when you're watching your child or your grandchild play. And maybe in those still small places, this is where you hear it. It is said that silence is God's first language. And it calls us to do what is ours to do. And it may appear meaningless or not important, and yet it is so serious. So consider these words from Wendell Berry when you're struggling, when you're asking yourself, what is yours to do? It is simple, it is deep, it is profound, and trust me, it has remarkably good consequences. In the dark of the moon, in flying snow, in the dead of winter, war spreading, families dying, the world in danger, I walk the rocky hillside sowing clover. Death controls the length of our days, but we control the depth of our days. And the depth of our days is a response to that voice that calls us the beloved. And to respond to that in our own way, in our own spiritual practice, it is when things seem stormy and out of control and perhaps hopeless, we walk the rocky hillsides, sowing clover.